Hi guys, welcome back everybody. Our topic, comparative social work. We were thinking in the last video, what are the benefits of this? What are the dangers? Why is it difficult? And it really is difficult to do. I want to move on though and be a bit more positive here. I want to spend this particular video discussing some of the literature, discussing the stuff that's out there, and showing you some of the books I like and some of the approaches that I find interesting. So my first task for you guys to consider together, how to compare, what to compare. Imagine you are a social work researcher. Fantasy, you're planning a big project, let's say a PhD project to do your doctorate, comparative social work. So you're looking at some aspect of social work in different places. What kinds of study could you do? What kind of fantasy research project could you imagine yourself setting yourself? Now, it's worth noting in the context of Europe, we often think of country comparisons. In my last video, I was talking about comparing England with Germany, for example. If you're in the US, you could probably even compare the evolution of social work between different federal states, because social work in Texas is so different from social work in New York. So that's an interesting point. Although we may, as Europeans, talk about different countries, in different parts of the world, you may want to look at differences within your own country, and that would be a valid thing to do as well. So hold on to that and think about the kinds of projects you could do, the diversity of comparative research that's out there. Pause here. Well, I'm hoping you had ideas for quite different projects. I'm going to focus on five different approaches to doing this. I'm influenced quite heavily by German authors, starting here with two book covers, actually two of my favourite German social work books. One's published in English, mind you, this one, Social Work in a Changing Europe. What a title, Social Work in a Changing Europe. Written almost 3 decades ago, but that title would still work today. This one is almost the same, Sozialarbeit in Europa. Both of these books are not only written by German authors, but also classically Germanic. Germans and Austrians love the big picture. We love to have a really big theoretical swipe, so this is a culture that produced Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud and all of these Bach, all of these big thinkers that have their own grand overview of everything. And that really is the feature of these two books. Both of them look at the diversity of social work as a whole profession across much of Europe. These are linguistically skilled professors. Lorenz has spent much of his life in the English-speaking world, but he also speaks Italian. Irat, as well as English and German, speaks French. So these guys, they have friends in different cultures. They can read literature that you or I couldn't. So they really have a big overview of large parts of Europe, if not all of it. So they're looking at the diversity of social work. You can almost say the diversity of social works. We in Germany, we have our soziale Arbeit, that's our social work. And your American social work or your British social work, that's a different social work profession. So they're really comparing the professions. And that means, how did those professions develop differently? For example, how did the subject for academic discipline of social work as something taught at the university and researched at the university, how did that evolve differently? It's a profession, social work is something that we do. How did that practice change in different settings in different countries? What about the discourses, the things that social workers talk about? This is a topic we'll come back to in the week. What kind of discourses do you get in different places? And another commonality in these books, the social policy context. So social work is a very political activity. Our politicians make laws, and these laws shape how we do our social work. So what are those contexts and how do they vary within the continent of Europe? So there you are, two particular German approaches, looking at the big picture and taking our geographical region as a kind of experimental setting to examine the diversity that you get in our professions. So a lovely big picture research project. Neither of those are actually PhD projects, although I think each of them could be. That really would be possible. Good, good. So that's one perspective. My next perspective is kind of a variant of this. We're also interested in comparing social work in different places, but we're zooming in on one particular aspect of the social work system, which is so big. And this book is particularly nice because Gilbert and colleagues look at child welfare. So they focus on child welfare and they look at countries' child welfare systems. So it's not all of social work, but rather one field of activity. Now, this is my example, child welfare. We could do the same with, say, social work of disabled people, or you could look at mental health social work. You could compare the systems that different countries have in that one specific area. Now, Gilbert and colleagues' point is different countries have different systems, but we can create clusters of these systems. So there's not an infinite number of variations, but rather most countries fit into, well, Gilbert and colleagues say most countries fit into one of three different forms. And their findings are really, really interesting. Their basis now is actually law. They're using social work law as the main criteria because the law defines the child welfare system. But also kind of tacitly, you've got this idea of how we implement the law. So the implementation of law, law applied to practice. So each society has its own formal social work response to child raising and child welfare problems. And I can summarize the findings briefly. It's really, really fascinating. Maybe we'll come back to this later in the week. The Anglo-Saxon countries are famous for a protection approach to child welfare. So their systems are dominated by protection questions. And on the continent in Europe, we have a quite different approach. We look at supporting families with various services. So in other words, the continental European may look at child welfare as a child raising or a family support system. And in the Anglo-Saxon countries, looking at child welfare from the perspective of potential protection issues. It's quite a fascinating conclusion. There's also a third category, which you'll find in here too. So we really can categorize our child welfare systems. That's Gilbert and colleagues' suggestion. The book itself, I should say, is a little bit less spectacular, though it has this beautiful key idea. What this book is simply a collection of case studies, and the reader is left to do lots of comparing. And that is a feature of the comparative literature. You often get collections of countries where there's a little bit of comparison done by the editors in the first and last chapters, but otherwise you, dear reader, you're left to find the differences as they can be found in the book. Yeah, so again, we have lots of work to do. Let's move on. My third category, let's zoom in on social work education. And this is actually a point I mentioned in a previous video. The case example I'd like to give here is Alice Salomon's study. Look at this in the top right, you can see it. Education for Social Work, a Sociological Interpretation based on an international survey. And this was published in 1937 by Salomon, a German, in the English language because she was financed by the Russell Sage Foundation. The premise is really interesting. Social work's identity is shaped by training and training institutions. In other words, universities, schools of social work, in the language of the time, schools of social work determine what social work is. So if I look carefully at the work the social work schools do, I can learn a lot about how social work is different in different countries. Salomon was finding points like the level of centralisation. Do all universities in a country provide the same content, the same syllabus, train the same social workers, or is there diversity within the country? One reason for diversity might be you have confessional schools of social work. The Protestant or the Catholic Church may train social workers, and there may also be state schools, there may also be private schools. So that landscape of different schools is different in different countries. And what about the curriculum? What are we teaching social workers to do? Are we giving them generic training for all kinds of social work, or are we being more specific? Are we focusing on particular client groups, for example, and training our workers for some and not others? So a whole bunch of questions you can ask there. And this particular example, Salomon's work, is quite historic because it really was one of the first big comparative studies of all anywhere. There you are. And again, if you're interested, certainly if you're a German student, Alice Salomon, a fascinating writer. I'm reading her collected works right now. Really fascinating stuff, well worth checking out, even if it was written almost a century ago. A fourth different approach, and one that I touched upon in my last video, examining social work history. Social work evolved. It evolved along with the history of the country which it was in. And if you look at social work history books, you can really reconstruct what we call path dependencies. So if you think of social work as being a profession which is institutionalized, it's anchored in our institutions, that gives it a kind of dynamic in its evolution, in its development. And it's easy in an institutional sense for social work to evolve in a particular direction and not in another. So we can look at these, what we call path dependencies, and we can find moments where maybe there's an opportunity for change, what we might call a critical turning point in that profession's evolution. And this all sounds a bit abstract, but I can give you a concrete example. Thinking about my birth country, England, in post-World War II, English social work became a state profession. And it was done by social services departments. And I've got a nice book here somewhere, if I can find it, A History of the Personal Social Services in England. So for a large chunk of the 20th century, that really was the context, the setting for social work to develop as a profession. So social work in England became a state activity almost by definition. Okay, and the contrast with Germany is really, really interesting. In Germany, the state never dominated social work in that way. Social work was never seen as a state activity in Germany. On the contrary, in Germany, the voluntary sector, charities, NGOs, they always did much of the social work. So social work was all shared equally by the state and the voluntary sector in Germany. Maybe even the voluntary sector had the lion's share in the overall big picture. So that's a fascinating example, the institutional historical evolution of social work. Now, I've given those examples, England, Germany. It goes without saying, those countries' history has shaped their social work professions. And the obvious example of Germany here, think of Germany in the Third Reich. Social work became part of that project. But you can also think about social work before and afterwards. Before the Third Reich, we had the Weimar Republic period, which was quite progressive. There was lots of dynamic progressivism in society, and social work became a bit social democratic in that period. After World War II, Germany had a kind of new conservatism, so social work didn't evolve so quickly. So it's quite fascinating to compare the profession's evolution with the historical context in that country, in that time. Maybe I'm influenced by my Germanness here. I've given you so many kind of macro, big picture approaches to comparative social work. Maybe it's nice for me to end on one that really isn't. It's the exact opposite. It's lovely to think about social work as being what we do, in our small, short interactions with the clients that we work with. And that's the approach of the last method of research which I'd like to highlight, a study called a vignette study. What on earth are these vignette studies? So we're looking at how social workers from different countries, from different nationalities, see and think differently. Okay, so this is the key idea. A social worker looking at their work in England will see it a little bit differently from a German social worker. And they'll see it differently because of the culture which they're surrounded by, differences in their training, and so on and so forth. And it's nice to try and measure that, to analyse that and capture the differences in how we see. So the basic classic approach to a vignette study is present the same case to small groups of single nationality social workers. So I may take a child welfare case, or I can even create one, write it down, put it in writing, and give it to these groups of social workers to look at. So the social workers all have the same nationality. You've got 3 English social workers, let's say. They read the case and they discuss it, and I record their discussion. And then I give the same case to a bunch of Belgian social workers. And again, they discuss the case, exchange their thoughts and their opinions on it. And as the researcher, I can then compare their comments. And their comments will reveal differences in looking at that case. So this is really quite a fascinating chance to look at the differences in social work as it is in our heads, resulting from our training, our experience, and the context in which we're practitioners. And this method is very powerful. It has variants as well. One variant would be to question each other about the other's reactions. So I could say to the English social workers, now the Belgians saw it differently from you. They mentioned this, they mentioned that. How do you find the Belgians' different response? Do you see what I mean? So I can make the whole vignette scenario even more complicated. And I mentioned at the beginning, you know, I can give them all a case to discuss. I could give them 3 cases to discuss, and each case relates to a different country. So there's all kinds of permutations of the basic concept. And I found one nice paper in a very recommended book. All of these books are in your literature list. This is a book on social pedagogy and working with children and young people. And a Danish chapter in here records videos of social workers doing their work in different settings. So you've got this children's home in Denmark, but there's also a children's home in wherever, Belgium, England. And then you can present these different videos and have the social workers commenting on it and thinking about it. So it's a lovely, doable, relatively small scale micro research project. Good. So those are 5 different perspectives. Now, of course, there's more. There's so many different ways of comparing social work, but these 5 come up often in the literature, and that's why I'm highlighting them. I want to move on now and spend the last few minutes just talking about something quite different, the literature in general, and for you, how to use it. Now, there's a list of books for this course. You'll find that with your notes. Please use our libraries, particularly the digital resources of libraries are wonderfully easy to access, as well as the paper books in your library. Please note, each country has its own distance lending system. My students don't use this enough. It really is fun to use. The only disadvantage is you tend to pay a small fee when you use this, regardless of where you are. In Germany, it's like €1.50. But I find it so wonderful to have books sent across Germany for me. Please note, if you're ordering a book and it comes from the other side of your country, it may take weeks to get there. So that's something to note. And that's why I always say, pick your topic, pick the literature that you want to study, pick it early. Don't order books at the last minute. I've got some books on my bed here next to my desk that I want to highlight as being resources for you guys to use. And a nice place to start is what I'm describing as international social work introductory textbooks. And this is a lovely example by Healy, which is often quoted, international social work. But there's many others which I'm drawing your attention to. In the States, international social work is often a topic maybe for a module in a master's program. So there really is a market for these books. They're much less popular in Germany, mind you. As well as those introductory textbooks, we also find these handbooks, which are almost too expensive to buy, but again, they should be in your library. There's a couple which are very, very good. There's a Sage one, which I've got here, and the Oxford one, which I have here. Both have a very similar format. The different chapters tend to be quite short and compact and quite dense, and each chapter deals with a different aspect of social work in an international context. For example, this book may have a chapter on human trafficking, a chapter on cross-country adoption, and so on. So they tend to group the different topics of practice thematically. So again, a good starting point resource if you're looking for a specific area of cross-border practice. I've already mentioned these country case study collections like Gilbert's example of child welfare. That really is quite booming at the moment. There's other child welfare case study contrasts. The same is true of other areas of social work, criminal justice, for example, juvenile delinquency. You'll find comparative collections where each country is represented by an expert in that field. And again, if you can get your hands on these, each one of them might inspire your essay for me. So I'm really quite open responding to your ideas for essay topics. So my tip is ask ask yourself today what topic interests you, start looking for books, online for your library, but also thinking about getting paper copies sent. There's so much literature out there, but it is hard to access, so start looking sooner rather than later. And if you do want to use for distance lending, order straight away. In terms of your essay, you've got something like a month to write the essay, and that's why this question is so urgent. Really important, look for literature before you finalise your topic. Okay, it's really important that you don't choose your topic based on what literature you're expecting to find. Choose your topic depending on the literature you can really get your hands on. One of my criteria when I'm marking your essay, were you able to find the material that really fits your own topic, your own interest? If in doubt, discuss with me. I'm always open to giving advice here, and we can even have a special one-to-one Big Blue Button session if you have any questions about your topic. One final tip, thinking about your essay choice, a lot of the time students come to me and they're interested in social work in a particular country, maybe because they have a personal interest in that place, family roots, let's say. I like this idea, it's lovely to have that motivation, but be careful. If you're looking for literature, you may find material, but you may not. Nobody can promise it. Particularly for smaller countries, there's often quite a lack of English language literature sketching the social work in that place. So my tip is always be a bit broader in your goal there. Consider picking another country in the same region. Okay, so you have an Estonian parent, but you grew up in the US. Obviously, you're interested in Estonian social work, but if you can't find any material on it in English, feel free to consider Lithuanian or Latvian social work instead. And there's another obvious example. If you're interested in the history of social work in Syria, there may be a real lack of literature on that. On the other hand, other Arab countries or other Muslim countries in the region, you can find quite rich histories of. Egypt, for example, or Jordan. Okay, so be a bit broad and don't get too narrow ideas of a country study until you've looked at the literature base first. As I said, some countries are well documented in English language literature, others aren't. Other final thoughts on writing this paper? Please note, maybe I've frightened you a little bit with my discussion of comparative social work and I've given you some of these big studies. Your paper does not have to be properly comparative. I'm not expecting you to compare social work in two different places, not at all. Many of these comparative studies really would be a PhD thesis or at least a master's program thesis. They're naturally very, very big projects. Instead, my interest for you, develop international perspectives, appreciate how things seem to be different in different places and be open to that difference. That's my main goal for you. Appreciate how social work can be different wherever we find it. Let me come to a close for now. Hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for your interest, guys. Cheerio.